All right, well, more breaking news tonight. A man is facing serious charges for sucker punching another man on a bike. And that man died from the injuries 7 years later.
This isn't just another tragic story, it's one that will make you question everything you thought you knew about safety, justice, and the terrifying randomness of violence. It was a warm June night in Brooklyn. The streets hummed with late-night life, the air thick with the scent of city heat and distant food carts closing up for the evening. It was the kind of night where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until, in an instant, everything changed. A man was riding his bike home, just a few minutes away from the warmth of his sleeping family. He had done this ride countless times before, a quiet routine, a path so familiar he could have traveled it with his eyes closed, but on this night, something waited for him in the darkness. Without warning, a single brutal punch sent him crashing to the ground, his skull meeting the pavement with a sickening impact. He would never wake up again. The attack was swift, senseless, unprovoked, and the man responsible, he walked away as if nothing had happened. Brooklyn had seen violence before, but this was different. There was no robbery, no fight, no motive, just a random act of cruelty that left a devoted father clinging to life and a family thrown into unimaginable pain. This is one of the most disturbing cases I've ever come across, and it will stay with you long after you hear it. A husband, a father, and a man loved by his community, taken in an instant by a single act of violence. His wife's heartbreak would stretch across years, her fight for justice turning into a relentless battle against time itself. This is the horrifying case of Gary Anderson. In the heart of Brooklyn, amidst the noise of the city and the steady hum of passing traffic, there was a small fruit stand on Church Avenue. It wasn't much, just a simple setup with wooden crates stacked high with apples, oranges, and bananas. But for those who passed by each day, it was more than just a place to grab fresh produce. It was where they could count on a friendly smile, a warm greeting, and a familiar face that made the city feel a little less cold. That face belonged to Domingo Diego Tapia. Domingo wasn't just a vendor, he was part of the rhythm of the neighborhood, woven into the lives of those who stopped by. He knew his customers by name, remembered their favorite fruits, and always had something kind to say, whether it was a tired mother picking up groceries after a long day or an elderly man stopping by for his usual handful of bananas. Domingo treated everyone with the same warmth. He had a way of making people feel seen, as if their presence truly mattered. His journey to this place had not been easy. Born in Mexico, he had left behind everything he knew, chasing the promise of a better life. Brooklyn had become his home, a place where he worked tirelessly to give his family a future filled with hope. It wasn't glamorous, and the long hours often left him exhausted, but he never let that show. At home, he was even more than what people saw at the stand. He was a devoted husband to Esther Diaz, the woman who had been by his side through every struggle and triumph. Esther was his rock, the one who kept their small apartment running, who made sure their two young sons, Pedro and Jose, had everything they needed. The boys were his pride and joy. No matter how late he got home, no matter how drained he felt, Domingo always found the energy to play with them, to sit with them, to make them laugh. Their apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant was small, but it was filled with warmth. Family photos covered the walls. Memories of birthdays, holidays, and simple moments that mattered just as much. On the refrigerator there were drawings made by Pedro and Jose, colorful scribbles of their family, always with their father standing tall in the center. Domingo and Esther didn't have much, but they had each other. They had love, determination, and the shared dream of seeing their sons grow up with opportunities they never had. They worked hard, saving every dollar they could, hoping that one day they could give their children the kind of life they had once only imagined. But life in the city came with its challenges. The bills never stopped, and unexpected expenses always found a way to appear. Domingo pushed through it all, never complaining, never letting the weight of responsibility dull the light in his eyes. He had come too far to let anything break him. Yet even in a life built on perseverance and love, there are things no one can prepare for, the kind of moments that come without warning that change everything in an instant. Domingo had built his world around his family, around the belief that as long as they were together they could withstand anything. He didn't know that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was about to be torn apart. June 8, 2017 began the same way it always did. Domingo rose before the sun, quietly moving through the small apartment so he wouldn't wake Esther or the boys. He kissed their foreheads before slipping out the door, locking it gently behind him. Outside, Brooklyn was already stirring. The streets hummed with early morning activity, the distant honking of taxis, the shuffle of feet on the pavement. Domingo mounted his bicycle and started the familiar ride to his fruit stand, just as he had done every morning for years. The day passed in a blur of familiar faces, small talk, and transactions. Regulars stopped by, some exchanging a few words, others simply nodding as they picked up their usual fruit. Domingo greeted each of them the same way he always did, with warmth, as if they weren't just customers but a part of his daily life. As evening fell, he packed up the stand, securing the crates and making sure everything was in order for the next day. It had been a long shift, but that was nothing new. He tucked the day's earnings safely into his pocket, swung his leg over his bicycle, and started the ride home. By the time he reached Bedford-Stuyvesant, the city had taken on a different face. The energy of the daytime had faded, replaced by the quiet unease of the late hours. The sidewalks, once crowded with shoppers and commuters, were now mostly empty, save for a few night wanderers making their way home. The streetlights flickered above him as he pedaled forward, the rhythmic sound of his tires against the pavement the only thing breaking the silence. He turned onto Fulton Street, his mind drifting to thoughts of his family. Esther would be asleep by now, curled up under the blankets, exhausted from the day. The boys would have been tucked in hours ago, their tiny chests rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. He smiled at the thought. Then, out of the corner of his eye, movement, a shadow shifting against the dimly lit sidewalk. He barely had time to register it before a figure stepped out from the darkness. Gary Anderson had spent most of the night wandering the streets. At 34 years old, his life had been a cycle of arrests, brief stints in jail, and aimless drifting. His record was long: assault, drug possession, robbery. But he always managed to find his way back to the same streets, moving through the city like a ghost, untethered and unpredictable. For reasons no one would ever fully understand, something in him snapped at that moment. Maybe it was the sight of Domingo, moving forward with purpose, with something to return home to. Maybe it was nothing at all, just the kind of senseless impulse that left destruction in its wake. Without warning, Anderson lunged. The punch came fast and brutal, striking Domingo square in the face. The force of it sent him backward, his bicycle tipping beneath him. There was no time to brace for impact, no chance to catch himself. His head met the pavement with a sickening crack. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, footsteps, hurried, retreating. Gary Anderson disappeared into the night, leaving Domingo sprawled on the cold ground. A woman across the street let out a startled cry. Another passerby rushed forward, kneeling beside him, their hands trembling as they reached for a pulse. Someone fumbled for a phone, dialing 911 with frantic fingers. The minutes stretched painfully, the bystanders watching helplessly as Domingo lay The ambulance arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. Paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing his body, checking his vitals. There was no response. They lifted him onto the stretcher, securing him as the doors slammed shut behind them. The sirens wailed as they sped toward the hospital, cutting through the silence of the early morning. Back in the apartment, Esther slept on, unaware that her husband, the man who had kissed her goodnight just hours earlier, was fighting for his life. The knock at the door came just before sunrise, a sharp, urgent pounding that jolted her awake. At first she thought she had dreamed it, the remnants of sleep still clouding her mind. But then it came again, louder this time. She reached for her phone instinctively, her heart picking up speed when she realized how late it was. Domingo should have been home hours ago. She barely had time to process the thought before she opened the door. 2 police officers stood on the other side, their expressions unreadable. "Are you Esther Diaz?" one of them asked. Her breath caught in her throat. "Yes. What's going on?" "Your husband, Domingo Diego Tapia, was involved in an incident earlier this morning. He's been taken to Kings County Hospital." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "What do you mean, incident?" The officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He was attacked. He's in critical condition." Esther didn't remember much of what happened next. The officers offered to drive her to the hospital, but she was already reaching for her keys, moving on autopilot. She barely registered the drive, only that her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the steering wheel to keep from veering off the road. When she arrived at the hospital, the fluorescent lights stung her eyes. The air smelled of antiseptic, the distant sounds of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps echoing through the halls. She ran to the front desk, breathless. "My husband, Domingo Diego Tapia, where is he?" The receptionist scanned her screen before looking up with a sympathetic expression. "ICU, second floor, room 217. Her legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the sterile walls closing in. When she finally reached the room, she hesitated. A part of her didn't want to see what was waiting on the other side. But she had no choice. She pushed open the door. Domingo lay motionless, a tangle of tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped in rhythmic intervals. His face was bruised, swollen, almost unrecognizable. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. A doctor entered moments later, his expression somber. "He suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. We've placed him in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling and allow his brain time to heal." The words barely registered. Esther clutched the edge of the bed, her fingers digging into the metal railing. "But he's going to wake up, right?" The doctor hesitated. "We're doing everything we can." She refused to accept anything less than certainty. The next few days blurred together. The hospital became her second home, a place where time lost all meaning. She sat by Domingo's bedside, holding his hand, whispering to him even though he couldn't hear her. She told him about the boys, about how much they missed him, about how she needed him to wake up. But the hardest part wasn't the waiting, it was facing their children. The first time she came home from the hospital, both boys ran to her, their small faces lighting up. "Where's Papa?" She had rehearsed what she would say, but when the moment came, the words caught in her throat. "Papa got hurt," she finally said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But the doctors are taking care of him." Her oldest, just 7, studied her closely. "Is he coming home soon?" She hesitated too long, his face fell. "He will," she lied. "We just have to be patient." She hated the way their excitement dimmed, the way they clung to her just a little tighter. That night, after she put them to bed, she sat alone in the dark, staring at the empty space where Domingo should have been. As the days stretched into weeks, reality settled in like a weight on her chest. Domingo had been the sole provider. With him in the hospital, their savings dwindled quickly. She had no job, no steady income. The rent was due. The bills kept piling up. She considered returning to work, but childcare was another expense they couldn't afford. The community rallied around them. Neighbors stopped by with meals. Friends offered what little money they could spare. A fundraiser was set up in Domingo's name, but it wasn't enough. Nothing could fill the void he left behind. Father's Day approached, a day that should have been filled with handmade cards and laughter. Instead, it was spent in a cold hospital room with Esther reading stories to her unconscious husband while their sons clutched drawings they had made for a man who couldn't see them. The weight of it all threatened to crush her, but she refused to break. She couldn't. Domingo needed her. Their boys needed her. She held on. Even as the days turned into weeks and the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her like an unbearable force, Esther refused to let go of hope. Every morning she woke up before the sun, packed her sons' lunches, walked them to school, and then made her way to the hospital, where she would sit by Domingo's bedside, talking to him as if he could hear every word. She told him about the boys, how their youngest had learned to tie his shoes, how their oldest had gotten a gold star on his spelling test. She whispered about the small victories and the struggles, about the nights she barely slept, about how much she needed him to come back. And yet, no matter how many times she pleaded, no matter how tightly she held his hand, Domingo remained motionless. The beeping of the machines was the only sign that he was still with her. While Esther fought a silent battle in that hospital room, the legal system was preparing to take its own course. 2 weeks after the attack, police arrested Gary Anderson. His criminal record was extensive, previous charges for assault, robbery, and drug possession, yet somehow he had always managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. The night of the attack, he had walked away as if nothing had happened, blending into the streets while Domingo lay unconscious on the pavement. Surveillance footage, however, had captured the entire incident. The grainy video showed Anderson approaching Domingo, striking him with a force that sent him collapsing onto the concrete. It was brutal, unprovoked, a senseless act of violence. Despite the severity of Domingo's injuries, Anderson was initially charged with third-degree assault, a misdemeanor. Esther couldn't believe it. A misdemeanor? Her husband was in a coma, and the man responsible for it might walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. She met with prosecutors, desperate to understand why the charges were so lenient. They explained that in cases like these, the legal system often focused on the immediate injuries at the time of the arrest. Domingo was alive, though barely, and the law dictated that the charges reflected that. If his condition worsened, they could pursue more serious charges, but until then their hands were tied. It wasn't enough. Esther refused to let Domingo be just another case, another name in a system that often failed victims. She spoke to reporters, reached out to community leaders, and demanded that justice be served. The story gained traction. Local news stations picked it up, highlighting the injustice of the situation. People rallied around her, outraged that the man who had shattered her family's life might not face appropriate consequences. In 2019, after months of legal proceedings, Anderson accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree assault, a felony. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It wasn't the justice Esther had hoped for, but it was something. The plea agreement included a crucial stipulation. If Domingo died from his injuries, Anderson would face additional charges. Anderson went to prison, but for Esther, nothing changed. Domingo remained in a coma, trapped in a limbo between life and death. His hospital room had become a second home, a place where hope and despair coexisted in an unbearable balance. She learned to navigate life as a single mother, even though she refused to accept that title. She still saw herself as Domingo's wife, as his partner, as the woman who would fight for him until the very end. But the burden was immense. The financial strain was suffocating. Medical bills piled up. The cost of keeping Domingo alive, of ensuring he received the care he needed, was staggering. She applied for assistance, leaned on friends and family, and did everything she could to keep going. Some days she felt strong, other days she wanted to collapse under the weight of it all. Years passed, the seasons changed, the boys grew older, and yet Domingo remained in that hospital bed, frozen in time. His sons learned to live with the absence of their father, but it was a wound that never truly healed. They celebrated birthdays without him, they started new grades in school, made new friends, and faced milestones he should have been there for. And then, in May 2022, Gary Anderson walked out of prison. Esther had known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the rage that boiled inside her when she saw his name in the headlines. 3 years. That was all he had served. 3 years for taking away her husband's life as they knew it. Anderson was released on parole, free to continue his life, while Domingo remained trapped in an existence that wasn't really living. Esther couldn't stand it. She had fought for justice before, and she would do it again. If Anderson thought this was over, he was wrong. Because as long as Domingo lay in that hospital bed, the fight wasn't finished. For nearly 7 years, his body remained trapped in that fragile state, kept alive by machines and the unwavering hope of a family that refused to let go. But hope, no matter how strong, could only carry them so far. March 2024 marked the end of Domingo's fight. His body, worn down by years of immobility and silent suffering, could no longer hold on. The machines that had once kept him tethered to this world were no longer enough. The hospital called Esther that morning, her heart already heavy with the weight of what she knew she would hear. Domingo Diego Tapia was gone. The news shattered whatever remained of the life Esther had tried so desperately to hold together. Her sons, now teenagers, had grown up without their father's voice, his laughter, his embrace. And yet, they had never truly lost him, not until now. The weight of finality settled over their home, turning grief into something even heavier, something permanent. The funeral was small but filled with love. Friends, neighbors, and members of the Brooklyn community came to pay their respects. The fruit stand, where Domingo had spent years working, where he had become a familiar, comforting presence, was adorned with flowers and handwritten notes. Strangers who had once bought apples from him now stood in silence, mourning the man they had known in small but meaningful ways. But for Esther, grief had no time to settle before another battle began. The moment Domingo passed, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office reopened the case. The plea deal Anderson had taken back in 2019 came with a condition. If Domingo died as a result of the attack, new charges could be filed. Now, there was no question Anderson had not just assaulted a man, he had taken a life. On February 17, 2025, NYPD officers arrived at Anderson's last known residence, a rundown apartment in Brownsville. He had been out of prison for nearly 3 years, living his life as if nothing had happened, while the family he had shattered struggled to rebuild. Now, his past had finally caught up with him. As detectives led him out of the building, Anderson didn't resist. He barely even reacted. Maybe he had expected this day would come, or maybe he had convinced himself he had gotten away with it. Either way, the weight of what he had done was now something he could no longer ignore. The new charges were serious: manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. This time there would be no easy plea deal. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Mitchell, was determined to see justice served. Mitchell was no stranger to cases like this. She had spent years handling violent crimes, fighting for victims whose voices had been silenced. But this case was different. It wasn't just another file on her desk. It was a story that had gripped an entire community, a story of injustice, of pain, of a family robbed of a husband and father. During the trial, the prosecution presented the surveillance footage from that night. The grainy black and white video played in the courtroom, showing Anderson's attack in brutal, undeniable clarity. The moment his fist connected, the way Domingo's body crumpled to the pavement, the sickening stillness that followed. Esther sat in the courtroom every day, her hands clenched together, her mind replaying every memory she had of Domingo. She listened as doctors testified about the extent of his injuries, how his brain had suffered irreversible trauma from the impact. The defense attempted to argue that Anderson had not intended to kill Domingo, that it had been a random act of violence with tragic consequences. But Mitchell countered with a simple, devastating truth. Violence has consequences. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent. The jury had deliberated for less than a day before reaching their decision. Guilty. A wave of relief washed over Esther, but it was not a victory. There was no real victory in this. Domingo was still gone. Her children would still grow up without their father. But there was justice, and sometimes that was the only thing left to hold on to. Anderson was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't enough, not for the life he had taken, but it was more than what he had received before, more than the system had given so many others like Domingo. As she left the courthouse, Esther looked up at the sky, whispering a silent prayer to the man she had loved, the man who had fought so hard to give his family a better life. She had done everything she could to make sure he wasn't forgotten. Now the world knew his name. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe that justice was truly served in this case? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe that senseless violence should never go unanswered, subscribe to the channel. Only those who think violence should be ignored won't subscribe.